Welcome, everybody, to part 3 of a student safety and wellness series. This has been a great series. We've had amazing guests over the course of the last couple of weeks. This is part 3 of 4. For those of you that are tuning in live, those of you that are watching this on a recording, of course, we do have 2 previous recordings that we've sent out available on YouTube and LinkedIn. This is coming out on all those channels, as well as my Twitter account. So for those of you following along at home, if you'd like to interact with this as we are recording it live, you can, of course, make comments on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter, and I will see the comments pop up on the screen. I want to give a quick shout out to our partners for this series. This is LineWise, linewise.com/learn more if you want to find out a little bit more about them. Amazing company I've gotten to know really well over the last year. I've done a lot of work with them and just kind of seen what they're doing in schools when it comes to cyber safety, digital wellness. This is a company that's a little bit different than most of the filter companies that I've ever come across in my time as a tech director, because I see them doing a lot of work and putting a lot of energy into the student side of things, the student psyche, how they're interacting online. And to that end, I'm excited to invite up on stage, quote unquote, someone who I consider an amazing expert at this, someone I've gotten to know quite well over the last about a year or so, and just kind of learning a lot more about what she offers in terms of cyber safety, cyber psychology, a little bit of everything, you name it. So Teodora, one of these days I'll get to visit you in Hawaii, but for now,
Please
we're visiting
do.
online.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell us a little bit about your backstory before we get started. Tell us a little bit about you, what got you into this field.
Sure.
Also, cyber psychology, probably not the thing you studied for right out of college.
No, definitely not. Well, I want to say hi to everyone watching. First of all, thank you so much for joining us, whether you're joining us live or watching a recording of this. This has been a really, really fantastic series. And I think this is probably about the third or fourth time that Carl and I have done something like this together. So I always look forward to these conversations. And I also want to say happy Safer Internet Day. So this is a really great day. Yeah, this is a really great day to be having this conversation. So yeah, my name is Teodora Pavkovic. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at LineWise, and I'm part of what is known as our Education and Wellbeing Division. And as Carl mentioned, and I just want to sort of toot our own horn there for a little bit, if I may, we are quite different than a lot of the other companies that you will come across that are in this sort of ed tech space who are trying to keep children safer online. I always like to say the very fact that I exist, that my role exists within LineWise, and the fact that we have a division called Education and Wellbeing. These are pretty strong indicators of the fact that we are quite different, in the sense that we're very much focused on not just protecting children online through our software solutions, so things like school filters and classroom management software and things of that nature, but also really doing that through educating the community. And that's really sort of the main task at hand for me as a Director of Community Engagement. So working with other members of my team, and working with not just school districts in the United States, but we work with schools in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand. We've been doing a lot of expanding over the past sort of year or two to really help those schools, those educational institutions support all of the communities inside. So support the parents, support the staff, support the students themselves, teach them about online safety, teach them about what digital wellness even means. What does that mean in 2023? And how can we really protect ourselves online outside of just using things like filters and parental controls and just sort of using tech as the solution, but how can we also educate the community when it comes to that? As you mentioned, this whole area of sort of online safety, on cyber psychology, it's a relatively sort of new and fresh field. My background is in psychology, but where I really received most of my training was in the area of clinical psychology. I worked as a psychotherapist for a little while, as a parenting coach as well. So I've always been very interested in families, and I've always been very interested in that parenting dynamic, but I always looked at it from sort of a slightly different angle. And it really wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 years ago that I started thinking about parenting in the age of technology. What is that even? What does that look like? What does that mean? What are the challenges that parents are facing? What are the challenges that the children themselves are facing as well? And what are some of the ways that I can help to support that I can help to sort of raise awareness around some of the obstacles that we face on a sort of daily basis in terms of how we're using technology that we often don't notice. We're not often aware of them because technology is so seamlessly integrated. And ultimately, that's really what led me to LineWise, and really the key reason why I was so excited to join the organization, because it's so different and because it has a sense for something that I really haven't come across with any other organization, or at least not yet, which is that technology on its own is just not a strong enough sort of tool. It's just simply not enough. We have to speak to all of these communities and educate them and really help to raise awareness. And so that's what I do, and that's what we do as an organization.
And I will say that in the interactions that we've had, I've always found that most fascinating about your advice, Teodora, is that a lot of times, companies will go straight to the tech tool, or is there an easy button technology-wise for parenting? And you're always hitting it on the point that it's all about the human interactions. So as a dad, I'm of a teenager now. I'm also kind of selfishly interested in hear what you have to say about today's topic. We're going to be talking a lot about social media and oversharing specifically. We've talked in the previous episodes, we've talked a little bit with Ross Young about just kind of the filtering and kind of the state of education when it comes to that front in terms of student safety. And then last week we spoke with Mike Ribble about digital citizenship and just kind of interacting online. But today, let's get into it. Let's start with just kind of a warm-up question here. Like, why are kids... And I could probably say adults on this too. Why are kids and adults, why are we attracted to social media? What's going on in our minds that gets us to it? Why do we just want to be on there?
Yeah, what's the big deal with social media? Well, I think there's sort of two pieces to that question. I think on the one hand, it's a question of why we or why children in particular are attracted to it. I think the second component there is why do they stay on it, or why do we all stay on it? And the reasons are sort of similar. I think to begin with, children are attracted to social media for that sort of age-old reason, which is everyone's doing it. All of the other kids are doing it, so why can't I do it, right? There's other elements there as well, of course. So, it looks really new and really fun and really shiny and engaging. It also enables you to connect with lots and lots of different people. You even might end up becoming famous, as a result of it. So all of these are sort of pretty legitimate reasons if you sort of think about why you were drawn to different things when you were a teenager. Really, any one of us. I think why we remain on these platforms is all of that, and then sort of plus. So some of these pluses are certainly the elements of persuasive design that are used to build all of these different platforms, and to also build our habits of sort of wanting to stay on them. Of course, we get lots of psychological, of emotional rewards from being connected to others online, from constantly discovering new information. We're an incredibly curious species, and we're always out to find new pieces of information. And certainly social media provides us with that. It also gives us a really solid amount of acceptance, or sense of acceptance, when you meet other people who are going through something similar that you're going through as well, or who look the way you do, or who listen to similar types of music. So there's always that connection as well. And then I would say ultimately, sort of one of the key reasons why children are so drawn to it is that parents are not really good at this thing called social media. So if you think about Facebook, for example, the moment at which kids kind of lost interest in it was when the parents and the grandparents started joining, right? And we've all sort of started coming off of that particular platform over the past few years. And actually, when you look at some of the stats, Facebook usage has dropped most drastically when you look at that sort of teenage and young adult age group. So it's a combination of all of those reasons.
Yeah, I think I interviewed some middle school kids once, and they called it Mom Book. They called Instagram Instagram off, because they're like, oh, we're getting on it now. So that kind of leads right into this next question, like, what platforms are they gravitating to right now? Now, I'm getting on TikTok finally, so I'm pretty sure that the answer is TikTok. But eventually, of course, in the next, like what you just said, in probably the next 5 minutes, they're going to be like, we're done with TikTok. We're going to go somewhere else. So where are they heading at the moment? What do you, if you kind of look at the lens of social media, what are you seeing as trends at this moment?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, TikTok is definitely the one that stands out, and I think all of us, if we see that question of what is the most popular platform, I think we'll definitely be most likely to say it has to be TikTok. And the Pew Research Center did do some research around this last year, and they did find that certainly TikTok has jumped in a very drastic way in terms of its popularity. Probably matched by sort of the amount of drop that Facebook has experienced sort of on the other end of the spectrum. So we know that about 67% of teens do report using TikTok, but it's still not the number one social media platform, which is really interesting. And even I was sort of surprised to learn that. So YouTube is definitely sort of on top of that list still, with a staggering 95% of teenagers who use it,
Wow.
which of course isn't all surprising, right? Because they're using it for so many different reasons. So it's not just about sort of that social interaction. It's also a lot about learning, right? Learning new skills, whether it's in a more casual setting or in the educational setting. So sort of in order, we definitely see YouTube being first. We see TikTok being next. And then, of course, we see Instagram and Snapchat. Now, another sort of interesting layer of that research is this question of what are the platforms that teens report that they're on almost constantly. And again, you might think that TikTok will take that number one spot. It actually doesn't. It takes the number two spot. Snapchat is actually
Wow.
number one. And again, you might be asking why. They're all social media platforms, right? So you would imagine they're all sort of created equally, and sort of the amount of interest and engagement there will be the same. Of course, that's not the case. And so this is where we go back to that concept of persuasive design. And this is why I advocate so strongly for parents, for educators, for everybody to at least understand sort of the basics of what we mean when we say persuasive design and persuasive technology. It's also a term I much prefer over talking about sort of addiction or the addictive elements of social media. But if you think about Snapchat and you think about TikTok, they've definitely been really, really good at providing those opportunities to connect in really fun, really quick, really easy, global ways, irresistible ways, perhaps even compulsive ways, you might say. And then in the case of TikTok as well, they've been really, really good, or their algorithm has been written so incredibly well to sort of keep showing you that content that is going to pique your interest, that is going to engage you, that is just going to keep you on that platform longer and have you wanting to see more and more of that content and see more and more of content that is related to it. So it's no surprise there that we're finding that Snapchat and TikTok are definitely up on top there. So if you have kids who are teenagers, it's very, very likely that they're on these platforms. And I would say if you want them off, one of the best ways to do that is to get on there yourself.
Yeah,
Just a little
that's
tip.
that's what I've done. So I've
That's
joined
what you're doing.
6 months
Yeah.
ago, and I know that TikTok actually has a parental thing where I can tie my
Yes.
account to my daughter's account, and we're getting ready to
Yes.
set all that up. And then I realized she's been really on it anyway because she's been watching short or YouTube shorts, like you said, the number one
Yeah.
platform, YouTube. So she's kind of had some access to the short
Yeah.
snippets of videos. And you mentioned a little bit of the benefits before we get into some of the dangers, and we're talking about oversharing here in a second too.
Sure.
Let's just highlight again a couple of the benefits. You mentioned connectiveness and kind of the ability to have a voice as being kind of the draws. Obviously, short form content over a long period of time is probably not good for the brain, but sometimes it's just entertainment and relaxing. Maybe it's anxiety and releasing or something.
Yeah.
I know that my wife likes to just veg for like 10-15 minutes, and as an adult we're modeling this too, right? We're like, I need 15 minutes
Yeah.
of just kind of endless surfing for a minute. So what are a couple of the benefits? Besides those, are there others that we're not maybe considering before we get into kind of the
Yeah.
dangers?
Yeah, I think it's all of the things that you've said. Really, I think you've kind of covered all of those different sort of key categories. I think one of the main ones for me that I really see as a huge benefit to the internet and to the online world the way it exists today is that is sort of right now where all the sources of knowledge are. Right, no matter what it is. that you're seeking out, whether you're looking for a tutorial on how to build a dining room table, or you're trying to find out some information about the ancient Mayan civilization. It doesn't matter what it is. You're going to be able to find all of it online. And not only that, you're able to find it in a lot of different formats. So you'll be able to find a video, you'll be able to find a podcast about it, you'll be able to read an article about it. You might be able to speak to an expert on the topic, or perhaps attend one of their courses. There's incredible things on there. I, for example, recently, just to share a personal example of something that blew my mind, I recently bought Dante's Divine Comedy. I've never read the whole book, and I discovered that Columbia University actually has one of their courses on Dante. So we're talking about, I think, something like 40 hours worth of courses by their leading lecturer on this topic, available free online. And that is, if you think about the type of access that you can have then to that sort of level and quality of education, free of charge, it's absolutely, it's incredible. So I think knowledge, that access to knowledge, is probably one of the key things. Having that information, having that connection, being able to collaborate with other people. Now, one of the words that I just used was access, which is a really important term to think about, especially when we consider the fact that in the United States, there's millions of children who actually don't have access to the internet, or don't have stable access to the internet. So you can immediately see what a key role the internet can play in some children's lives, and they simply don't have access to it. So that digital divide is something that I know a lot of people are working on to bridge, and we really need to keep working on that. But outside of that, it can widen your horizons. It can sort of increase your knowledge about other people, about other cultures. If you do have issues with your physical or mental health, of course, it can help you with that, and it can connect you with people who can help you with that in ways which can sometimes really be life-changing for a lot of families, for a lot of individuals, for a lot of children. And then, of course, outside of those, we do have the ones that are perhaps not as critical in certain ways. They are in some ways, actually. Definitely social connection is critically important for children. Entertainment-based benefits as well. So like you mentioned, your wife will like to spend 10 or 15 minutes unwinding. I myself like to do that as well. One of my, I don't think I've ever said this online, but one of my guilty pleasures is to watch YouTube beauty vloggers. I just, there's something about it that I find
That's
really
amazing.
fun and interesting. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and you can see that there's millions of people who kind of indulge in the same sort of guilty pleasure as I do. So we do have lots of great opportunities to be entertained, to be amused online, to be socially connected as well. I think when it comes to children, the question there is, and the kind of ongoing debate is, how much of that the social and the entertainment-based connection needs to happen online, as opposed to how much of it really needs to happen offline, when we're talking about their psychological, emotional health and development. And this is the area that we're all sort of struggling with a little bit, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, whether you're an expert, whether you're a pediatrician, an educator, whatever it is. That word balance, it has not been very well defined yet. And there's a little bit of that tug of war of trying to figure out, that famous, well-known, notorious question around, well, what's the ideal amount of screen time? We don't know that yet. And it's not just about time, it's about quality. So it's really about finding that balance for every child and for every family, to make sure that while we want them to have that access that is going to benefit them, and we want them to be a part of this world, we want them to feel included, we want them to feel enabled, empowered, we also have to make sure that they're able to develop some of those key human skills, that AI will never really, hopefully, be able to sort of take on. So things like empathy and compassion and kindness and understanding, critical thinking, problem solving. We need kids to develop those, and we have to make sure that we give them a good balance of online and offline opportunities to develop those skills.
Yeah, I think when you think about another layer of impulsivity, that sometimes, like I'm thinking about my kids, and I won't call any one of them out right now, but one of them in particular tends to be a little more impulsive. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, if she gets, we don't have a phone with her or anything like that yet, but I mean, there's gonna be a point. She's very curious about all this stuff. There's gonna be a point where she's gonna start sharing, probably oversharing, which kind of leads to our next question. And this is kind of a big topic we're gonna talk about today. And that is, what's the idea behind oversharing? And I've actually heard it referred to with parents as sharenting, which I thought was interesting. Like, parents actually oversharing too much stuff about their kids. Talk a little bit about why it could be potentially a dangerous thing. I mean, we talked about the benefits of connection, and I think that's good. And actually, contributing to things that are helpful was always great. But in some cases, maybe we overdo it. Tell me a little bit about oversharing and why that could be potentially dangerous for kids.
Yeah. So again, I think that word balance, it becomes really critical when we're talking about this aspect of our online lives. So finding that balance between, and this is kind of backed by research as well. Finding that balance between not sharing anything online and just being a very sort of passive consumer of whatever content it is that you're discovering on there, and also contributing. So that's where the research has also shown that we want to make sure that children, but this applies to adults as well, find that balance where too much of being passive online and just consuming everything that's coming at you is really not good. It's not healthy. It can even lead to mental health issues. But then there's that question of oversharing. So what is oversharing, and how do we sort of make sure that we don't do it? I think the first sort of task at hand, or the first challenge is to sort of define what do we mean by oversharing. I think it's another one of those areas that we're under aware about, because the parameters, I think, have changed a lot over the past few years, and we interact with technology so much that we're often not aware exactly of what we're doing. So for one, there's a question of who or what are you oversharing with? So are we talking about the platform itself? Are we talking about the information that you're sharing with the platform? Or are we talking about the other users that are inhabiting that virtual space? Or are we talking about both? Then the question is also, are we oversharing about ourselves? Because there's implications when it comes to that. Or are we sharing about others as well? So those are some of the important things to think about, and certainly to talk to children about as well. But again, you mentioned sharenting. It's an important topic for parents to think about as well when they're sharing about themselves and when they're sharing about their children, especially if these children are very young. So some of the biggest dangers when it comes to this certainly have to do with children sort of putting themselves in a vulnerable position. That's probably the easiest way to think about it, by sharing some of that personal information, some of it more personal than others. But things like their passwords, for example, their address, or the name of the school that they attend, or the name of say the club that they attend, after school hours, sharing their location on sort of a regular basis through something like Snapchat, for example, or Google Maps, or any of the other sort of devices or platforms that they might be using. And then, of course, we're talking about some of the most sort of severe or serious kinds. So things like sharing nudes, or sharing sort of compromising photos or videos or texts, and sharing these about themselves. So when it comes to other people's information, we're talking about certain similar things. So we're also talking about sharing information that can potentially put another person into a vulnerable position. But we're also talking about some of the more nuanced things, which is really where children need our help and support. And when I say our, I don't just mean parents. I mean educators. I mean everybody who is around that child, who's their village, if you will, because there's some of those more nuanced situations where you really have to sort of figure out what you're doing, and do you want to do it that way. So, for example, if one of my best friends shares a text with me, or a video with me, saying that he's really, really sad, and he needs some help, do I share that with other friends? Do I share that publicly? Do I share that privately? What is or isn't appropriate to screenshot? What type of content, and then to share that on? Again, whether it's privately or publicly. So these are some of the questions that I always encourage both, like I said, parents and educators to talk to children about, because I think one of the key things that those of us who work with children, with young people, one of the things that we find here is that they've become pretty, I think we all have, but they've become pretty sort of desensitized to what sort of the general tone and narrative of the internet is. And so then what we often find is that they actually underreport a lot of instances of things like bullying, or of other people sharing inappropriate information, or saying inappropriate things to each other. And they often do it, when you ask them why, they'll say, well, that's just how people talk. That's just what they say. That's
Yeah.
just how people interact online. And we have to change that as soon as possible. It's a process, but we have to start working on it if we haven't yet, as soon as possible, because for one, I think that's absolutely tragic. But it can also be potentially seriously problematic and seriously dangerous as well, because again, this is one of those things that we're leaving to the next generations, right? And so we need to make sure that we, first of all, leave it to them in good shape. And hopefully, we're trying to work on that through making these platforms much more safer and work more efficiently when it comes to that. But we also need to make sure that the holders of those platforms, or rather the users of those platforms one day, who are our children now, are really going to know how to use them in healthy and responsible ways. So that's where that, you mentioned digital citizenship earlier. That's where digital citizenship is so incredibly important, where media literacy is so incredibly important, why it's so important to speak to children about what are and aren't appropriate ways in which we treat each other online. These really shouldn't be any different than what we do offline. So if there's certain things that are and aren't appropriate to say to an older person who you might see on the street, then we also want to replicate that same behavior when we're online as well.
Yeah, I've seen so much how the world of online is blending into the analog world of interaction with my own kids, but when I watch them with their friends, and just kind of like the kind of the sayings and the expressions. I mean, I don't know how many times my 14-year-olds call me bro, like, hey, what's up, bruh? And I'm like, I'm not your bruh, I'm your dad. But I hear that a lot. And I've even
Yeah.
had some of her friends come over and say, what's up, bro? And I said, nope, turn around, come back in the house and address me the proper way. And like, am I being an old stickler,
Let's
or am
try
I like,
this again.
yeah, let's start over. Hi, my name
Yeah.
is, you shake my hand. And but you're right. I mean, in that little bit, and we kind of, as we let it go, it tends to get like, okay,
Mhm.
this is the norm now, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we don't talk about a lot, we're going to hit on this subject a little bit here, and that's, yeah, you were talking about sharing nudes and sexting, oversharing. These are uncomfortable conversations that a lot of parents don't want to have. And I'll be honest, a lot of educators don't want to be involved in it either, because it represents a lot of
Mhm.
things dangerously. We talk about legalese too, of just like child pornography and things like that. But I want to hit specifically on grooming, because I've had some interactions with folks who have shared stories with me, and heart-wrenching stories about how they just didn't see signs, their kids didn't know. And it was very subtle, like how it just slowly becomes a thing where like they're interacting with somebody and they don't really know. And I'm not trying to scare people here either, but it's like, what are some of those things? What are some of the signs we maybe need to be aware of? How could overdoing this stuff really lead to that? Because you just mentioned, like,
Mhm.
socially, it's affecting us in the way we talk and communicate. So maybe it's just going to continue to evolve. If we don't pick up on those signs, maybe it could lead to something worse.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. And I think the some of the key words there are sort of slowly and gradually, because typically that is how grooming itself tends to happen. When we're talking about sextortion, obviously the two are very closely linked. And certainly a groomer may try to use sextortion as sort of one of their tools. We do typically find, though, that grooming is something that tends to happen over sort of a long period of time. It does involve sort of relationship building, which is a horrible term to use in that context, because typically it's a positive thing. But in this case, of course, it can lead to that really really deep connection between the groomer and the child, which of course can have really horrible and sometimes tragic and dangerous consequences. Sextortion, what we've been noticing over sort of the past 6 months or a year, when the rates of it have really really gone up, is that it tends to happen a lot more quickly, and it will happen on platforms such as Instagram and Snapchat, for example, where it will be a very, very quick interaction, where a person will, express their sort of attraction to another person. Very soon after that, ask them for some nude images, and then very quickly after that, we'll start to blackmail them, and we'll start to ask for money. And then, of course, if they can't provide that money, it will escalate very quickly. And we have found a few examples, again, over the past year, where not too many, luckily, but even one is too many, where young people have taken their lives as a result of this, because
Oh,
they couldn't see any way, out of that situation. So I think some of the key things to remember is, groomers feed on personal information. So that is, that is key. That is, I think, one of the most important thing for parents to remember. And unfortunately, what we do find is that 85% of youth who do experience this tend to be 13 and younger. So what you were saying earlier in terms of a lot of parents just not wanting to have to deal with this, which of course I completely understand and have compassion for, we've now been kind of put into this situation where we have to start having these conversations, I think, a lot earlier than we like to with our children, or with our students. And the other thing to remember also is that groomers don't always need to rely on sort of very dramatic or deeply personal information in order to sort of do what they do. So I mentioned things like sharing passwords earlier, or sending nudes and things like that. For example, a child could share that their parent, who maybe is a single parent, maybe they work full time, they never come and pick them up after soccer practice ever, and that makes them really sad, and they're very upset. And so it's always the neighbor, for example, who has to come and pick them up. That might seem like a relatively sort of innocent piece of information to share, but it's the kind of thing that someone who is intending on grooming a child will use in order to then manipulate that child, and sort of lead them into thinking that, well, that parent clearly doesn't care about you, but I care about you. I actually love you so much more than that parent does. They then might engage in doing things like sending the child gifts and just showering them with care and with compliments and things like that. And that would be considered a vulnerable child in that case. And again, they would have shared a relatively innocent sort of piece of information, and it would have come from the right place, because they're hurting, and they're upset because of this situation. If you're a 7 or 8 or a 9-year-old, that's probably one of the most tragic things that can happen to you, right? Is your parent not picking you up after school or after soccer practice. So this is something that not even necessarily a very, very skilled groomer will certainly kind of zero in on and will use. And so a lot of these little pieces of information, it'll rarely be just the one. As it, the longer sort of that it takes, the longer that this process unfolds, the more information is going to be collected over time, and again, sort of the deeper that relationship is going to become. So I think a few of the things for sort of parents to keep in mind or to use as they think about addressing this with their children. For one, personal information in 2023, how we define it is exactly the same as we did 5 years ago, and 10 and 20 and 30 and 40. Things
Right.
have gotten a little bit, like I said, the parameters have been disrupted and have been moved because of social media. And we share so much about ourselves and our lives that we've kind of, I think, lost that sense of what personal actually means. We've become a lot more open, but we have to think about it in the context of our children, and then have those conversations with them around expectations. So what are the types of things that we do or don't share with others about our family, or about our family life, about the things that happen on a daily basis, about the things that you talk about with your parents or grandparents or your guardians, whoever it is who's in that environment. We also want to encourage children as much as possible to really think critically. Again, we're talking about digital citizenship now a little bit, and even media literacy, but it's also that kind of relational intelligence too. So, if you want to use that old, stranger danger sort of approach, that's all right. But an even better way of talking about it is to really talk to your child about sort of thinking about the motivation behind a stranger wanting to approach them. What does it sound like they kind of want from you? Why do you think they're approaching you? Why do you think they asked you this question? Why would somebody want to send you a gift? Or why would somebody sort of give you a compliment? What do you think that they want in return? So really, really trying to get them to sort of think critically is just a much more sort of empowering approach for your child. You want to make sure that they know how to detect this when they're out there, in the world, as they inevitably will be very soon, and they're kind of left to their own devices, literally, to figure out and to sort of protect themselves. And then ultimately, and this is of course the least favorite piece of advice is to talk about sexting and to talk about nudes, and to also normalize it for the child. As they're getting older, once they hit that middle school age, maybe even younger, they're going to be curious about these things, and they're going to have their crushes and their likes, and they're going to have people who they'll want to like them back. And so of course they might be thinking about sexting and about sending nudes or videos, or whatever it is. But I know that for parents, their stomach probably turns at the very thought of that. For children, it probably does too, because they don't want to speak to their parents about this.
Right.
But it's really important that your child knows that that you're aware of this, that that this happens, that there are risks involved. And again, it's really just getting them to think critically when they're faced with that situation, whether it will be an actual partner of theirs who maybe makes that request, or it will be a complete stranger, or whoever it is. They'll be able to at least think critically, and really make a decision around, is this the right thing for me to do right now, so that they can make a much more informed decision in that moment.
Yeah, I think that communication is such an important part of this entire process, and that openness. I think parents, us of an older generation, are aware of the, when someone comes to the door and say mom and dad are out for a minute, you don't tell them that we're out, right? You just say, oh, they're in the bathroom, they're doing, whatever, so or you don't answer the door, those kind of things. Well, that's a physical thing that we're all very aware of. Just like, don't get in the white van, that runs down the street. Don't believe in the candy
Full
or
of
puppies that
candy.
they're selling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think because we were raised with it, that's like a natural, okay, we can just say that over again. But this is so new to us as parents. Having these uncomfortable conversations, I think, is a big part of this. And this is an interesting comment here from Melody, who actually drops in and says, our middle schoolers talk about this often, and keeping them in the loop. It's important to let them know that it's not about judgment. And I think that's a great point. We're not going to judge you based on what's happening, but if you're not aware of it, I think some parents listening to this might now be thinking, oh man, I just want to turn it. I want to turn it all off. I don't want to have access to anything. But we know better.
Yeah.
I mean, because we were teenagers too.
Yeah.
We're going to find our way to get into these areas. And if we're not having open conversations, they're going to get into even more. I mean, I feel like they would get into more mischief if we don't at least have an open conversation. So I love that you said, even though it's uncomfortable, it does need to happen. So kind of my last question for you is this kind of advice? I'll say advice for students, but also for parents, that just, I think we've identified some of the benefits of social media. We've, of course, identified the evils of it too. So in that word balance that we brought up a few times, what are some, just like a couple of quick tips of advice to say, like, hey kids, like, here are just a couple things that are good about it, things that you might want to, to be connected to the good things, but also to kind of, when you see the bad things, like kind of what your first reaction should be.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the really sort of great, I don't know if that's the right word, but one of the great things about the fact that some of these platforms are being used so much is that it's really forced them into thinking about safer design, right? None of these platforms, first of all, were created with children in mind. I think that's something we all have to keep in our minds. But now that there are so many children flocking to these platforms, the platforms have really been forced to figure out how they can make these spaces a little bit safer, how they can do things like empower young people to exactly what you said, to control their experience online, to try and experience more of the good and get rid as much as they can of the bad. And then also how to involve parents as well. So certain platforms like TikTok, for example, Instagram as well, for parents, has a lot of options where you can come in and you can really be more involved in what your child is doing there. I would never recommend that you do that sort of behind their back. It can always be a really, really great conversation starter, something that you can talk to your kids about how you can utilize these platforms together and do it in a much safer way, but also make it very clear that you will still give them their space and you will still give them their privacy. You won't do things like check on their messages, for example, behind their back. But for the young people themselves, there are lots of things there that you can do in order to try and remove the sort of the negative accounts, the negative people who might be trolling or who might be bullying, who might just be making that a really unpleasant place for you to spend your time. So on the one hand, I think it's about setting up some of those controls, making sure that you're not exposed to the content that you don't want to see, you're not exposed to the people who you don't want to come across. But then in terms of the do's, you definitely want to, if you're on that platform already, to really seek out ways of positively engaging with that platform. So seek out the people and the organizations that just make you feel good when you're there, and they help you learn new things, and they help you maybe rethink and question things in a really positive way. They help to expose you to things that you perhaps wouldn't be exposed to otherwise, sort of in your physical, in your offline world. Also think about how you show up in those virtual spaces, how you can make that a much more positive space for other people. So anytime I talk about digital wellness, no matter what your age is, it's really not just about sort of protecting yourself from the bad that's on there, and it's not just about making it a better place for you. A really important way of thinking about digital wellness is how can you as an individual make that virtual space better for everybody else who's on there, and for everybody else who's going to be interacting with you while you're in that virtual space. So those would be some of the things. I think the word balance, again, is really key. So on the one hand, we want to think about how we can sort of remove or take away the negative influences. How can we set up some of those safety controls on there? But we then also want to think about how can I proactively engage and create and communicate and just show up in a much more positive kind of a way, so that this is a much more pleasant space for me and for everyone else who's there.
I could talk to you for hours about this, Teodora. I just realized that we're at 40 minutes. And there's still a lot of questions I have swirling around in my head. So where can people find more about you and the great information that you have to share out there? I know you're on Twitter. You want to share that real quick?
Yeah, so people can easily find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, all these other places, and I'm horrible. I always forget what my handles are, so you'll have to forgive me. Luckily, I have a relatively unique name though. So there you go, Carl helped me. Thank you, Carl.
Hey, there we go. See, I had it ready.
Perfect. So yes, so you'll be able to find me there easily. I would of course also encourage everybody to head over to our LineWise website to see all the wonderful different things that we're doing. And of course, as I mentioned, I'm part of our community team, our education and wellbeing division. So I encourage you to head over there and to have a look at what we do as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Melody, for jumping in on the chat there too. Yeah, this is
Thanks,
a great
Melody.
conversation. And if you got in a little bit late, everybody, that's okay. This is recorded. I'm going to send Teodora off stage for just a second. Thank you, Teodora, for joining us. Guys, this has been a 3-part series. Now this is a 4-part series. We're actually on part 3 today. And so, again, we've built this up over time. So we started with a kind of a base level conversation about kind of the lay of the land with Ross Young. We talked about just kind of internet safety in general, filtering, all the things that schools are doing, some of the things that parents are doing. Last week, we met with Mike Ribble, who has written a couple books on digital citizenship. He's also a professor and a tech director. Of course, today we had Teodora, who's just amazing. You can already tell the amount of information she has in her brain is always captivating. I always learn something from her. And immediately my first reaction is always to go home and change something that I'm doing with my own kids, because I sometimes am guilty of maybe grabbing that phone and just looking through some of the things they're doing. But I think I need to make that a little bit more of an open conversation. So girls, if you're watching this, they never do, but if they are, know that I'll come home and I'll be careful about that in the future. This has been a student safety and wellness series brought to you by LineWise. Again, guys, check out that little link there at the bottom, linewise.com/learn more, to find out more about some of the great things that LineWise is doing. You heard a little bit about it from me and myself and Teodora today. Next week will be the final of this 4-part series. We're going to bring in Dr. Susan Bearden, who worked under the Department of Education, has done a lot of work around this field overall. So we're going to talk about things like AI, which we're all very much front and center in our mind right now, but also kind of wrapping up the conversations we've had around digital wellness, citizenship, social media, and all of the above. So with that, thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.